I am Dracula. I bid you welcome.
Hello everyone, welcome to my first Halloween related video, the first of several that you're going to be seeing over the next few days as we get closer to October 31st. That grand holiday we all know as Halloween, where the ghosts, the goblins, the monsters, the vampires, the werewolves all come out to play. The macabre and the weird and the scary become the norm, and where a bunch of kids bug us for candy, but that part's fun so I don't really mind. Actually miss trick-or-treating, but today, if you paid attention to that wonderful intro I made for you, you know that we're going to be talking about Dracula today. Dracula, based off the Bram Stoker novel of the same name, and is a character that found its way into cinema and, in my opinion, became one of the most influential movie monsters of all time, probably the most significant, and he has roots that go all the way back to the silent movie era. And what is there to really say about Dracula that hasn't been said? He's great. He's the king of the vampires. It's everything that a great horror villain is supposed to be. He set the standard for horror villains. And I found that there are so many great portrayals of Dracula, so many great actors have played the character, that it's almost become like a James Bond thing where there are all these debates over who is the best Dracula. And there's so many different movies and so many different portrayals to go over that it's really hard to settle on just one. Who is the best Dracula? It's really a tough debate, and I'm going to try and settle that as best I can here today. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to know everything about Dracula. I'm not going to sit here and say I've seen every single Dracula movie ever made, because I haven't. For example, I never saw Dracula 2000, because quite honestly, it looked terrible. But I have seen many portrayals of Dracula, so I'm going to try and cover each one that I've seen, all from live-action movies. Cartoons, I've seen so many different portrayals in cartoons that I would literally be here all day talking about it if I counted all the animated versions that I've seen. So I'm going to exclude those and stick strictly with live-action portrayals in movies of Dracula. So here we go. And before I get into the really good ones, because I really narrowed it down to 5 Draculas that I think you could consider to be among the best. But before I cover those, sort of the Hall of Fame of Draculas, I'm going to get into the not-so-good ones. So let's start that off right now. 1931, Universal Pictures made the film Dracula, the movie starring Bela Lugosi as the title character that would ultimately set the standard for the horror genre for decades to come, as well as making Bela Lugosi one of the most famous horror icons of all time and making Dracula one of the most famous movie monsters of all time, one of the all-time greats. However, a lot of people don't know is that there was a Spanish-speaking version of Dracula also made by Universal Pictures at the same time as the Lugosi version. Why they did this with Dracula and not any other of their classic monsters like Frankenstein or the Wolfman, I have no idea. But I finally saw this movie a couple years ago, and I had always heard about it in documentaries and things of that nature, but I'd never actually seen it until a couple years ago. I'm glad I did. It was a really good version of Dracula. I felt like they actually improved upon it from the Lugosi version in a lot of ways. The way it's shot, a lot of the special effects they use. It's a little bit more elaborate than the Lugosi version. The place where this movie really fails, though, really fails to be better than the Lugosi version, why I always consider the Lugosi version to be better, is Dracula. Carlos Villarius played Count Dracula in this movie, and he is downright laughable. It almost feels like a parody of the Lugosi character with his googly eyes and everything. I mean, just look at him. I think the Count from Sesame Street is more credible as a vampire than this guy is. It's just a shame because everything else in the movie is really good, but every time Count Dracula walked on screen, I would just laugh because he just always had these goofy facial expressions on him, and it's really a shame because otherwise it's a really good movie, and I recommend it to any horror movie fans, but it just didn't click with the performance here. This is another one of the Universal Draculas. After doing a lot of sequels to a lot of their more famous monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman, Universal had decided, hey, we got these great monsters, let's cross them over. So that resulted in films like House of Dracula and House of Frankenstein, where they decided to mix their most popular monsters together to make a big monster mash. And they were mostly entertaining films, I will say, but John Carradine as Dracula didn't really click with me. Again, it was probably part of the Lugosi stigma, is that he wasn't Bela Lugosi, and he just didn't look right in the costume. He didn't look right as the character. It just didn't. It didn't feel like Dracula, and especially with the Universal logo attached to the film, it just really felt wrong that Lugosi didn't play the character again. I don't understand why they didn't keep having him play the character. He only played him again in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is really bizarre. But yeah, John Carradine just didn't really click with me, and he's a fine actor. It had nothing to do with his acting. It's just, I don't think the costume looked right. He just looked cheesy in the role, and that was something that Lugosi was somehow able to escape. But John Carradine couldn't escape looking cheesy as the character, and ultimately it just wasn't one of my favorite Draculas. Oh, God bless Leslie Nielsen. I love that man. He was in Airplane, one of the funniest movies ever made. He was in the Naked Gun series. Those were great. He was in that show Police Squad, which was short-lived, and I honestly believe had it had come out 15 years later, it would have been one of the hottest shows on TV. But it was just too far ahead of its time. And then you have Mel Brooks, who I adore. The producers, Blazing Saddles, History of the World, Spaceballs, Young Frankenstein, the other Halloween movie parody that he did. But Dracula Dead and Loving It, you would think having Leslie Nielsen in the lead role and Mel Brooks directing would be just comic gold. And it had its moments, you know. It was, you know, kind of okay-ish. I loved it as a kid. I don't think it aged very well at all. Definitely the weakest out of Mel Brooks' films, I think. At least the ones that I've seen. He's probably done other movies that I'm not aware of. But, yeah, Dracula Dead and Loving It. I thought it was, you know, it would probably live on to be a comedy classic, and then watching it again, I'm just kind of like, yeah, it's not very good. And Nielsen's performance, it's a farcical performance. It's meant to be a parody. And it does have some funny moments. I'm not going to sit here and say the entire movie's a failure. It does have its moments, and Nielsen is charming in the role. It's just that because it's a comedy and because it's more farcical, I'm not going to consider it among the elite of Dracula performances. But Leslie Nielsen, still love you, man. Richard Roxburgh played Count Dracula in the film Van Helsing, which came out in 2004 and starred Hugh Jackman as the title character in a film that was meant to kind of be a celebration of the classic Universal horror films. And I was really looking forward to that film. Finally saw it, and I was kind of like, it's kind of just typical summer blockbuster crap. It wasn't anything special and kind of dumb. Kind of like a Michael Bay movie. But it wasn't that good of a movie. And as far as Roxburgh's performance as Dracula, it was very much referencing previous Draculas that came before him. There was a little bit of Langella in there. There was a little bit of Bela Lugosi. Those seemed to be the two that he borrowed from the most, which felt appropriate because those are the two biggest Universal Draculas. But overall, it's just kind of like it was a tribute performance. It didn't really feel like it had enough of its own unique stamp on it to really be considered among the best of the best as far as Draculas go. Now, before I get into my favorite Draculas, I do want to highlight these two characters that I do believe deserve a level of praise. The reason they aren't considered among the best Draculas is because they technically aren't Dracula. But I do feel these characters in these performances do deserve to be highlighted, so here we go. As I said before, Bela Lugosi never played Dracula in any of the Dracula sequels, which I thought was really strange. But there were two sequels produced by Universal Pictures. There was Dracula's Daughter, which starred Gloria Holden as Countess Zaleska, and there was Son of Dracula, which starred Lon Chaney Jr., better known as the Wolfman, and he also played the Frankenstein monster once as well, maybe twice, I don't know. A lot of people played the Frankenstein monster, but I know he at least played him in Ghost of Frankenstein. But Lon Chaney Jr., who was famous for other characters, also, he lent himself to Dracula as well. And I think both of these performances are worth noting, at least. Gloria Holden in particular, because I do think that Dracula's Daughter is a heavily underrated monster flick among the classic Universal films, and Watching it for the first time a few years ago, I could kind of figure out why it gets overlooked a lot. It doesn't have any of the big name horror actors in it, like Karloff or Lugosi or Lon Chaney Jr. It doesn't have any of them in it. And I think that lends itself to kind of being forgotten among the classics. And it's really weird. We have this great female monster that had an entire movie dedicated to her, and nobody remembers it. I mean, hardcore fans do, but a lot of people forget about that movie, and yet The Bride of Frankenstein is extremely famous, and she's only in that movie for about 4 or 5 minutes, and that's not until the tail end. So it's really strange how those type of things work out. But Gloria Holden, I really liked her character. I really liked this movie. I really enjoyed it. There were a couple problems with it. I'm not going to say it's perfect. A lot of the timeline in particular, it's supposed to be a direct sequel to Dracula, and watch Dracula's Daughter and you'll see where the timeline compared to the first movie is really messed up. But I just really like the way they handled her character, the tortured soul that this character is supposed to be. And she ends up being like a really fierce monster, and there's some implied lesbianism going on as well, which is, you know, for the 1930s is pretty extreme. But vampires are very sexual beings, so there you go. And as for Lon Chaney Jr. as the son of Dracula, this one's a quizzical one. Again, I kind of feel the same way about Chaney's performance as I do about John Carradine, where he just didn't look right in the costume. He didn't look authentic. He didn't have that same presence that Lugosi did. He's great as the Wolfman. I mean, my God, he's great as that. But as the son of Dracula, he doesn't really carry it. And the movie is very vague about what he is exactly. They call him Count Alucard, which is, hey, it's Dracula backwards, which is kind of carried over and becomes somewhat of a famous joke. Or not a joke, but a famous trademark of the series. But I don't know. They never really say if he is the son of Dracula. Some people believe he actually is Dracula, but because the movie's Son of Dracula, people just assume he's the son. I don't know. They leave it very open to interpretation of what he's supposed to be, actually. So I considered counting him among the Draculas. But I do think it is worth noting. It is from a key Dracula sequel. Not one of my favorite Dracula performances, but I decided to highlight it. And if you haven't seen Dracula's Daughter, go check it out. If you're a fan of those type of old-school monster movies, I think you'll enjoy it. I think it's a pretty good one. Okay, now a little background on this one. Nosferatu was a German silent film made in 1922, and it was without authorization, so it's a bit of a controversial film in that aspect, but it was inspired and based on the Bram Stoker Dracula novel. Even though the characters in the movie have different names. For example, the vampire character in this movie, played by Max Schreck, is referred to as Count Orlok, although the version I saw, and I've only watched this movie once, but the version I saw had English cards. You know, if you've ever watched a silent film, they give you the little dialogue cards. And in the version I saw, they did call him Count Dracula, and they kept all the characters' names from the Stoker novel. So, but I'm sure that if you saw like a German version of it, it would call him Count Orlok. And that's the official name given to the character, but I have to count this as one of the key Draculas, because it was such an influential portrayal of the character for many people. I mean, if you look at Tim Burton's work, especially when Tim Burton was good, you'll see heavy influences from Nosferatu in there. Actually, when he made Batman Returns, Christopher Walken's character in that movie is named Max Schreck, which is directly referencing the actor who played Count Orlok in this movie. And, you know, this is a movie that, even though it's a silent film, and I do admit that in today's day and age, silent films are very hard to watch, because it's just hard to sit through an entire movie with no audio dialogue, with no soundtrack at all besides background music. This movie made the most of it, and it was a visual spectacle. I mean, the sets and the visual aspect of everything that was involved in creating this world was all very creative. And Count Dracula, or Count Orlok, whatever you want to call him, in this movie, very well done from a visual standpoint. The way Dracula looks, with the great, pure white skin and the bald head and the pointy ears and the long fingernails, was really a great way to create the character visually and portray him as this monster. And he looks like an otherworldly figure. And, it's one of the best early movie monsters, without question. And it was a great physical performance by Max Schreck, and every little thing that they did visually to bring this character to life was just great. That shot of him going up the stairs, and you only see the shadow, and a lot of the great visuals come from shadows, and a lot of that comes from him having such a great look with the long fingernails and everything else that went along with it. But there's that great shot of him creeping up the stairs, and that great shot of him popping up out of the casket, kind of levitating out of it. And just the look of the makeup and everything. I mean, Lon Chaney was remembered as the Silent King star and the big, the Man of a Thousand Faces. He was in Phantom of the Opera. He was in Hunchback of Notre Dame, which were early classics for Universal. And he's kind of remembered as being the key, movie monster guy with the makeup and everything. But the way Count Orlok, Max Schreck, looks in this movie is very, very good. And I think some of the key images associated with the character of Dracula. And even if you've never seen Nosferatu, I guarantee you've seen this look for a vampire before. And I know there was a remake of Nosferatu made in like the 70s or something, but I've never seen it. But just for its pure influence and its great visual nature, I have to count Max Schreck as one of the best Draculas of all time. Well, I already referenced Bela Lugosi several times in this video, and how can I not? I mean, Lugosi, for a lot of people, was their first exposure to Dracula. He was mine. The first version of Dracula I ever saw was the 1931 Universal film. And his performance of Dracula is so iconic, both from a physical aspect and from his line delivery. Everything he did in that role was just iconic. And I almost can't separate his performance from the character of Dracula. I mean, he's become the measuring stick for the character. And a lot of things that he did, a lot of his dialogue has become synonymous with the character, and largely because of his delivery and the way he carried himself and his on-screen presence. I never drink wine. Children of the night, what music they make. And everything like that. And you see those lines find their way into future Dracula performances. Even if the performance is totally playing against Lugosi, that dialogue keeps finding its way into Dracula performances. Gary Oldman used a lot of them. Frank Langella used the quote about the wine. It's just a perfectly iconic performance that you really can't separate it from the character of Dracula, even though it's not that much like Dracula is in the novel. Actually, the closest to the novel, and I'll get to this in a little bit, is probably Gary Oldman, maybe Max Schreck. But I like the way Lugosi carries himself. I like the way I like the idea of Dracula being having two personalities, or putting on a face where he's like a gentleman, and when he's approaching people in regular social situations, he's able to carry himself well and be charming. And Lugosi is able to do that. He comes across as a very friendly guy, maybe a little off. Kind of like, have you ever seen Terminator 2? Well, I'm sure everybody's seen Terminator 2, but the T-1000 in that movie, he seems a little off when he's playing the police officer. Just a little, maybe he's a little strange, but not to the point that you're put off by him and thinking, and it gives you the willies. It's this very subtle performance. And then when he goes full-on monster, it's downright frightening. And that's what Lugosi brought to Dracula, where he seems a little weird, but not so much that it's scary. When he's being sociable and talking to Renfield and Jonathan Harker and Mina and Lucy in very regular situations. But then when he goes on the hunt and he gets violent, he gets scary. And that piercing stare he has is just perfect. And there's so many things and so many mannerisms that he does that when I think it, I just think Dracula. And when I think Dracula, I think Bela Lugosi. So Bela Lugosi, definitely one of the best Draculas of all time. Now, the Hammer Dracula films were a major stepping stone for the character in the 50s and 60s. Dracula was presented in color, which, as far as I know, Christopher Lee is the first Dracula to ever be presented in color. He's at the very least the earliest one that I know of that was in color. So if there's one that came before that, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of it. But Christopher Lee is the earliest one that I've seen in color. And that allowed them to do a lot of things with the character that had never been done before. There's that shot of Christopher Lee with the blood dripping down the fangs, and we got to see those things. We had never seen Dracula even with fangs before. Lugosi never had fangs. And to show blood in color, that was also a major stepping stone. The Hammer films were a lot more violent and a lot more sexual, a little bit more extreme, and those were major aspects that the Hammer films took advantage of and presented Dracula in a very different light. And really helped to solidify Christopher Lee's performance as one of the iconic and one of the key Draculas of all time. What do I think of Christopher Lee as Dracula? He's Christopher fucking Lee. What? I mean, he's the man, okay? Christopher fucking Lee, I'm going to keep calling him that, is awesome. Christopher Lee just has a stage presence to him that you can't teach, you just have it. And anybody who's ever seen him, I know younger audiences probably know him as Count Dooku from Star Wars and Saruman from Lord of the Rings. And why did he get those roles? Because he's awesome, and he just looks awesome in everything he does. Everything he says sounds awesome. It's just, Christopher Lee just has a natural presence and presentation to him that you just can't teach. And that personality, that presence is perfect for Dracula, and he brings that to Dracula. He looks awesome in the role, and whenever he's going on the hunt and he's killing people and he's forcing women down and biting their necks, and he was a very... like I said, the Hammer films were a bit more extreme, and this is where the sexual nature of Dracula really came a little bit more than most. And a lot of his scenes, especially when he's attacking women, are very extreme and very, for lack of a better term, rapey. And Christopher Lee was just perfect at that, and he was scary whenever you saw things like that, and the violence and everything else that went along with it just made everything more intense. And it also helped that he was playing off in the first Dracula film, The Horror of Dracula. He was playing off against Peter Cushing, who played Professor Van Helsing, and those two just had a great hero-villain dynamic, and that made it even better. That Christopher Lee had a strong opponent. I mean, Edward Van Sloan played Van Helsing in the Lugosi version, and he was pretty good, but he's no Peter Cushing. And Christopher Lee is just a great villain, great presence, great everything. My one knock on him in Dracula is, and this is through all the Dracula movies that he did, at least all the ones that I've seen, he doesn't have a whole lot of dialogue, and that's kind of a problem. Because it's Christopher Lee. I can't imagine how somebody could have that voice and you don't take advantage of it and have him say more things as Dracula. But most of the time we just see him attacking people and snarling and going on, biting people's necks and things of that nature, which is great, and he's fantastic at it. I just wish they'd given him more dialogue and let him be more gentlemanly, like Lugosi was. And actually, in The Horror of Dracula, the first couple of scenes he's in where he is like that, and the only scenes in the movie where he talks, he does carry that. He is very approachable and very friendly and outgoing and things of that nature. It only makes his turn into the monster even more shocking and more startling in a lot of ways. I just wish they'd given him more dialogue. I know there were certain problems behind the scenes of why they didn't. Apparently, Lee didn't like the dialogue that was scripted for him, so he just opted to go mute for most of the performance. But for whatever it is, Christopher Lee truly is one of the best monster Draculas. I mean, he was definitely the most imposing and one of the scariest. In the 1970s, Universal decided to remake Dracula with Frank Langella in the title role, and it was really cool. I mean, Langella is one of the big Universal Draculas now, right along with Lugosi. Now, I knew who Frank Langella was from a very young age because I saw the Masters of the Universe movie, and he played Skeletor in that movie, and he was awesome. I love him for that performance. Take from that what you will. But I always knew who he was, and I always knew that he had played Dracula at some point in the 70s, but I never saw the movie until years and years later. And I finally saw it, and I'm looking at this cast. You got Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing. You got Donald Pleasance from Halloween fame as Dr. Seward, and then you got Langella as Dracula. I'm like, oh, man, this is going to be one of the best Draculas ever. I mean, there are a lot of problems with it, unfortunately. It was middle of the road at best. It was not everything that it could have been. But all of that said, whatever my problems, whether it be the acting or some of the story decisions that they went with, or especially the ending ticked me off. All of that aside, Langella was pretty sweet as Dracula, and I liked his performance. I liked that he brought something different to the role. And I kind of talked about it with Lugosi, where there's a very gentlemanly quality where he puts on a face. And when he's in front of people in a social situation, he's putting on a performance. And then when the lights go out, he becomes the monster and the attacker. Well, Langella kind of keeps up that gentlemanly, like, suave and very likable manner, but it's naturally him, and I kind of like that. It feels like, he's not bullshitting when he's at the dinner party, and he's very charming, and he's charming all these ladies in there. And it's more of a romantic process, him draining the blood of these women, whereas, in a lot of vampire literature, the act of draining blood from your victims is seen as very sexual, and I talked about that earlier. And it's often compared to rape. I guess you could use the Christopher Lee performance to, compare to that. But Langella is treated like a seduction and very romantic. And the relationship between him and the leading lady in this movie, I believe they went with Lucy. For some reason, Mina and Lucy keep getting switched in these movies, but I think it was Lucy in this one. It's treated like a forbidden romance, like this love that society won't allow. And she doesn't feel like she's a victim here. She's legitimately in love with Dracula. And I thought that was an interesting role to go with. And Langella played it really well. And when he has to be forceful and when he's attacking John Harker and everything, he comes across very well. Actually, the image of him grabbing the crucifix and it bursting into flames is one of the key images associated with the character of Dracula. And Langella just carries himself really well. And I'm glad I saw the movie just to see Langella's performance. A lot of other problems with it, unfortunately. It could have been much better, but Langella, as one of the Universal Draculas and as one of the better ones, actually second probably only to Lugosi, he deserves to be mentioned on this list. Now here you have Gary Oldman, who played Dracula in the film Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, which was a pretty big movie when it... At least I remember it being that way. I remember it being a big film and heavily marketed. I don't remember how it did at the box office or anything like that, but I do remember seeing a lot of it when I was really young. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to watch it because it was an R-rated film, so I didn't see that one until I was into my teens, and it is a very visually interesting film, and I do appreciate it. I did appreciate that they went to, the route of trying to emulate the novel as close as possible, although they did add some stuff that was a little, weird, like Mina and Dracula. Mina was Dracula's reincarnated lost love, which I thought was a little strange. That's the plot to The Mummy, okay? the original Boris Karloff Mummy. It felt a little misplaced in Dracula, though, especially since... this portrayal of Dracula was not romantic at all, and not very charming at all, deliberately so, because that's how he is in the book. And Gary Oldman, I love him as an actor, because he never turns out the same performance twice. He's just, he just loses himself in whatever character he plays, and I really liked him as Dracula. I thought he was really good. I liked that a lot of the makeup that went into creating the character, which is not something you saw a whole lot of with... Langella or Lugosi. Christopher Lee, a little bit with the fangs and everything, but not much. Not since Max Schreck, really, have you really seen a Dracula that was really this well created through makeup. And I love that they took the route that the book does, where he looks like an old man early on in the book, and then after he's fed on some victims, he looks more alive and younger and fresher and everything like that. That was a very nice trait that I'm glad they added in, and it gave Dracula a lot of different looks throughout the movie. I thought that was really cool. And sometimes they borrow from the book a little too much. There's some scenes where they handle exposition by having somebody write in a diary or writing a letter and saying, so this is happening, we're going to this, and this, and this, and this is happening. And the reason they did that is because that's how the book is written, where the whole book is just a bunch of journal entries and letters that are strung together to create the entire narrative. And it works in the book because it's, a book, but it doesn't work in the movie as well because, it's a visual medium. You can just show us that stuff. You don't have to have somebody writing in a diary to tell us what's going on when you can just show it to us. But, I do appreciate they did a lot of things with Dracula that were close to the book. I didn't really touch up on this before. The idea of Dracula being a transforming beast, a transforming type of monster. In the book, he could turn into fog, he could turn into the wolf monster, he could turn into a bat monster. And before that, we'd never really seen that. We see him, in the Langella version, he turns into like a wolf. And in like the 30s and 40s, you see him turn into a bat, but it's kind of shitty because of the limitations of technology. Here, we actually get to see it really well constructed, and I really, really liked and appreciated that imagery of him as the wolf monster, kind of, crouching over his victims and everything like that. So a lot of great visuals associated with this version of Dracula, and he sounded great too. Obviously, it felt like it was an amalgam of several different performances. There's a little bit of Lugosi in there, a little bit of Langella, a little bit of Lee, and with with Gary Oldman putting his own spin on it, and just looking so vastly different from every other Dracula that had come before him. So, I really do appreciate Gary Oldman's performance as Dracula. I thought he was very good. So now it's time to answer the question, who is my favorite Dracula? Who do I feel was the best performance as the King of the Vampires, that is Count Dracula? I guess we can eliminate Frank Langella right off the bat, because I already said he was the second best Universal Dracula, putting him behind Bela Lugosi. So that leaves Max Schreck, Bela Lugosi, Gary Oldman, and Christopher Lee, and all of them great Draculas for one reason or another. And making the decision of which one I like the most is very hard. I think they all brought something different to the role, whether it be visual or in dialogue or an overall presentation or whatever. They were all very different and unique interpretations of the character. But if I had to pick a favorite, and maybe it's just a lot of, maybe nostalgia has a lot to do with it, but I gotta go with Bela Lugosi. I think Lugosi is my favorite. I think the voice and the look and everything he brought to that character, when I think of Dracula, I think of Lugosi. That's the first thing that pops into my mind. And I think I said earlier, at the very least, he's the measuring stick. And I cannot separate Bela Lugosi from Dracula. And again, that was kind of to the detriment of his career. I think you can definitely argue that Christopher Lee and Gary Oldman are better actors than Lugosi, even though Lugosi wasn't bad. But it was just that he was just born to play that role. He was born to be that character, and it was just kind of, one of those magical things where the stars aligned, and he was just ended up bringing out a performance that influenced movies for decades to come. And even the performances that play against the Lugosi character, there are always little tributes to it somewhere. It was just such an influential and iconic, and that's the word I keep going to, iconic. He just owned that role and made it his own, to the point that you can't even, it's really hard to even see the real person in there. It's just, that is Dracula. That's the guy. And I think it also benefits that his movie's in black and white. And that's something that's key. I said that was a major plus for Christopher Lee, that he was the first Dracula in color. But I think when I think of Dracula, I think of all that gothic imagery and all the the scary settings and the spooky castles and everything of that nature. And that just looks so much better in black and white. And again, that's part of why Max Schreck was so good. But I don't know, being in black and white just adds so much to that version of Dracula, and it also helps that you can actually hear Bela Lugosi's dialogue, and that also brought so much to the table as well. So if I had to pick a favorite Dracula, and again, I'm sitting here with somebody, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to say that I've seen every single Dracula ever made. I have not. This video, as long as it is barely scraped the surface of all the Draculas that are out there. But of all the Draculas that I've seen, all the live-action performances that I've seen, my absolute favorite is Bela Lugosi. No doubt about it. He's number one. He's the best.